Okay, you're all recording now, no swearing.
Oh, dear me.
Please, Joe.
Just give another 2 minutes, just in case the staff trying to come after they finish things up one.
Or
And then
Just do that.
I just go with the study.
Yes. Yes.
And then, okay, just whatever.
I'm actually not graduate.
As long as,
I mean, six months.
That's fine. Okay, I think I'll get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you very much for coming in person or digitally to the seminar today. I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Alexander Lees, who, in his words, reminded me that we know each other because he's a random person I met on Twitter. And that is absolutely true. It's one of the reasons why Twitter is really quite remarkable. In fact, Alex was just telling us a second ago about a recent paper that he published that really just started as a random series of rants and conversations on Twitter that eventually led to a published manuscript about geese. And the reason that Alex has been invited down here actually is also to do with a series of random conversations on Twitter, as we're just beginning a new project looking at harvesting and social ecological systems. And so that's one of the reasons why he's come to visit us today. But as part of that, I asked him to give a seminar about some of his own work. And Alex is a senior lecturer in tropical conservation biology, but with a specialism in ornithology, or as his friends like to say, he's a massive bird nerd. He likes birds a lot. And he works on a really big, kind of diverse set of questions on birds and working on birds from all over the world. He started his academic career here in the east of England. He is his undergraduate and postgraduate degrees at the University of East Anglia. And he's held postdoctoral fellowship positions at Cornell, Cornell Ornithology Lab. I'm not going to be able to pronounce or remember.
Museo Paraense Miliogeology.
Two positions there in Brazil and also at Cambridge, and is currently at Manchester Metropolitan University. And today he's going to talk to us about a very interesting and seemingly uncontroversial topic of feeding birds. Everyone likes to feed birds, but as he will explain, there are sometimes consequences for all our actions.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks for the invitation to be here. So, move forwards, perhaps not. I'll be frozen then. Move on now. Brilliant. So sort of my bread and butter research then, to be honest, it looks at sort of complex sociological systems in the tropics and in the Amazon basin. I sort of mostly ask questions about birds myself, but work with lots of people who work with people, with diverse other taxa. So sort of my big overarching sort of research involves worked with this sort of diverse sort of learning network, if you like, the Hedge Amazonian System Derby, the Sustainable Amazon Network. But as Tom said, I also kind of I'm interested in lots of other different things as well. And in the remit of some of our Amazonian work, which is typically being sort of measuring biodiversity change, or unfortunately often sort of counting extinctions almost, it's occurred to us that although sort of environmental factors like the amount of forest you've got, or the type of forest, or the level of degradation, or connectivity, or any of these other sort of landscape metrics we use to look at changes in biodiversity are important, there are also species interactions which mediate these changes in biodiversity. So interactions between species along these sort of gradients of environmental harm dictate sort of which species win and which species lose, which species persist in human-modified tropical landscapes, for instance. And this is also true of human-modified landscapes as well. So I've done a little bit of work in sort of urban ecology. So I'm interested in that now, especially living in the middle of Manchester. So in terms of what you can get undergrad students out doing here. Fortunately, we have a beautiful campus like you guys here with bearded tits. We're considerably more limited campus up there in terms of what wildlife there is. But cities are interesting, right? Because they are this entirely novel landscape. There's no sort of ecological precedent for a city. So they have this sort of idiosyncratic assemblages of species, and again, there's a strong signal for competition in mediating which species occur in cities and which species don't occur in cities. And we have sort of some systems where one taxa occurs, and some systems where two taxa occur, where they're sister species, and one outcompetes the other one. So interactions between species are really important, as well as sort of environmental factors in dictating which species can live there. And this can even sort of influence what species even look like. So I'm also sort of interested in the evolution of avian phenotype. So, why birds look like the way they do. And we sort of found a signal there for basically sort of mimicry within groups of bird species, which is sort of evolved because of like social dominance. So you have a subordinate species mimicking dominant species in order to fool third-party species, for instance. So competition is really important. It not only sort of dictates what species occur where and when and why, but also even what those species can look like. And then he sort of recently sort of wrote a book with a great friend of mine, James Gilroy, who we were just talking about earlier on, who might end up working with Tom, it seems, on avian vagrancy. It's something, again, I've been interested for a very long time, sort of why species occur extralimically. And again, the role of interactions is incredibly important there, because we often think of vagrants, species, these odd individuals, as being biologically unimportant, but actually, well, they're fundamentally important for the colonization of islands. There wouldn't be any biodiversity in islands if it weren't for vagrants. But even the interactions of vagrants arriving in island systems can be incredibly important, through processes like predation or transfer of parasites, or in the case of something like a humble mallard, which might end up on the island of Hawaii as a vagrant there, might end up dying there, but end up transporting viable biological material in its gut, plant seeds or viable fish eggs, etc. So species interactions are incredibly important in structuring biodiversity. So sort of jumping back then to what a lot of the stuff I do typically then, sort of measuring changes in responses. And a PDRA who worked with me, Jack Shutt, sort of applied to lead some of this Amazonian work. This is, again, species distribution models for an obligate flock-leading small understory Amazonian passerine called the Thamnomynus caesius, Cyrus Antrak here. So basically, his postdoc is involved doing some incredibly sort of computationally difficult GIS work, trying to work out edge effects across an area the size of South Africa. So that sort of left him almost sort of twiddling his thumbs for a bit of his time, just waiting there for all these massive models to turn over. And sort of before Jack came to work with me, he did his PhD up in Edinburgh, and was sort of looking at well, not necessarily species interactions, but looking at sort of provisioning of wildlife. And he was doing lots of work on sort of blue tit diet across this huge gradient in Scotland. And we're sort of amazed to find that, it's like all blue tits in Scotland basically have access to peanut feeders. I mean, incredibly so, even in sort of remote areas of the Highlands, seem to be travelling sort of 2 kilometres or more to access this food. And this wasn't something they were expecting. They were doing sort of fecal metabarcoding to work out what blue tits ate, and were sort of really surprised to find that, like 50% of their diet was peanut. So whilst, Jack's models were sort of whirring in the background, we had various conversations about sort of bird feeding and the impacts. And it sort of dawned on us when we started looking at this data that, our sort of provisioning of huge amounts of resources sort of into the British countryside, must be having all sorts of cascading ecological impacts, which perhaps, we've not considered in great detail. So we ended up writing this sort of big opinion perspective piece in Biocom, which is essentially what I'm going to be sort of talking about today. This idea that, we've sort of got a handle on some of the positive impacts of bird feeding, but maybe there's lots of hidden negative impacts as well. So the first thing we tried to do in this manuscript was to sort of trying to conceptualize the way in which we provision wildlife. And this is stepping back from just thinking about bird feeding, but the way we sort of provide resources, to all sorts of wildlife, be that as a conservation intervention or a harvesting intervention, or be it intentional or even, unintentional. But, in sort of the way in which we interact with the countryside or natural environments, we end up providing, for wildlife. And that must have sort of not necessarily trickle down effects, it might have huge sort of cascading effects among ecosystems. So we thought about sort of 2 axes of variation, whether or not this targeting, whether or not provisioning for wildlife was targeted at a single species or maybe a couple of species, or whether it's just sort of generalized provisioning, it's sort of just putting food out there which might be used by a whole host or a community of species. And then whether or not this targeting, this provisioning was replacing resources which have been lost, or whether it was basically providing additional resources for this community of organisms. So first example here then, conservation biologists often end up providing nest boxes, for instance, to help threatened bird species. So we know in many forest systems that the logging of old growth forest means we lose large trees with their associated cavities. At which point, the absence of these cavities may be a limiting resource for many species conservation concerns. So providing nest boxes is a conservation intervention, and it's often targeted at a single species. So in this case, the critically endangered Santa Marta parakeet occurs in Colombia, that species. And we know that this sort of provisioning, has been, these sorts of conservation interventions, be it, providing sort of carrion for California condors, because otherwise what they were scavenging was either sort of whales full of PCBs and bioaccumulated nastiness, or scavenging hunter kills full of lead or whatever. That it was important to provide carrion for this species, such that that food wasn't a limiting resource. Various species here, like the top ones here, I can show you here. These species are all basically extinct in the wild. These first ones. So this was a paper that looked at the sort of success of conservation interventions. But there are several species here for which provisioning was very important. So pink pigeons here have been extensively fed in Mauritius, for instance, and there's been, in addition to other sort of interventions like predator control, for instance, in those systems. But feeding has been very important for those, as it has for barley miners and echo parakeets and several other species on that list. So, provisioning wildlife is a proven sort of conservation intervention, which has helped prevent extinction in various species. So another example then of lost resources, but rather sort of generalized provisioning in this country might be feeding farmland birds. So, we've seen catastrophic declines of farmland bird species in this country, probably associated with increased biocide usage, for instance, or more effective biocides, and this sort of collapse of farmland sort of agro-diversity, plus, probably various other cascading impacts actually from, sort of increased predation for one of them, land use change, degradation, all sorts of different impacts, but we know they're often very food limited. In fact, a big sort of sea change has been a shift of winter wheat, for instance. So there's been much fewer stubble. So basically providing food for farmland birds, again, is a proven conservation intervention to sort of get them through what's termed the sort of the hungry gap. Another nice example might be provisioning of carcasses for the vultures in Spain. And there's a really cool paper here by Biological Conservation a few years ago, which sort of contrasts the movement ecology of here on the left griffin, on the right sun areas or black vultures, between Spain and Portugal. And in Portugal, you have to essentially, people there, farmers, they have to dispose of their carcasses of livestock. So no sort of fallen stock is left in the countryside, whereas in Spain, fallen stock is left, which essentially constrains the distribution of these two vultures because there's very little food in Spain, for instance. So again, sort of calling indeed on changes in legislation there. But again, the farmers' provisioning of this resource means that these vultures are doing all right. And then we have additional resources. So an example here is sort of targeted provisioning of additional resources. Could be various different initiatives to attract animals for tourists to see. Be that sort of cage diving or free diving with sharks, or baiting anthitters in tropical forests, for instance. You're attempting to show a group of people an organism, and you're providing additional food to do that. It's not like it's mission critical for the survival of these species to have this food provided to them. It's just an additional input of food. And then we have also sort of generalized provisioning of additional resources, and some of which occurs at quite large scale. So I'm not sure if any of you guys have spent much time in Africa. So in many areas, there's been a huge sort of movement towards provisioning of water holes, for instance, to attract game for hunting tourism and for sort of conventional ecotourism. And that's created sort of quite big ecosystem shifts, because many of these species are limited by water availability. Creating water holes in desert systems ends up changing community structure. Indeed, it's been shown to be sort of ecosystem disservice for many sort of scarce species which are adapted towards sort of mesic regions, and you create water and they can be displaced by others, for instance. So there's quite a sort of emerging literature on the impact of water hole provisioning. But again, it's not a targeted provisioning, it's a generalized provisioning supposed to attract wildlife in general, but again could be having sort of deleterious impacts. But the big one, sort of globally, is garden bird feeding, right? It's something which is sort of second nature to us here in the UK, and also incredibly important sort of activity in many other parts of the world. So globally, then, the bird food market is valued at the $5 to $6 billion and growing at 4% annually. And this is a huge change sort of in the last 4 or 5 decades. So what I want to concentrate on for the rest of this talk then is to talk about this sort of paradigm of bird feeding, of this generalized provision of additional resources. So in the UK then, 17 million UK households, which is about 64% of us, spend around £250 million on bird food annually. So it's 150,000 tonnes of bird food is sort of emptied into UK countryside in an effort to bring birds closer to us. And this sort of vast sort of booming resources then is enough to feed 3 times the entire breeding population of the 10 commonest feeding using bird species year round if they consume nothing else. So we provide enough food to provide for all the birds several times over. Obviously, a lot of that food gets eaten by non-targets like rats or mice, or ends up rotting and it's thrown away. But the point is, we're providing a huge resource boom, which is, as we've mentioned earlier on, with the blue tip study in Scotland, is essentially available, for almost all birds that want to access it in the entire country. This is just to show you, sort of Googling bird feeding here and getting 2 billion results. So it's quite a big business, and something that many people can relate to. So on the ground here in the UK, and UK is quite exceptional in that we are a relatively small island with relatively high population density and sort of this famous nation of animal lovers, right? So the UK isn't maybe representative everywhere in the world where bird feeding happens. We're sort of the real sort of extreme, essentially. And we're looking at like 100 bird feeders per square kilometre. So that's sort of 1 feeder per 9 feeder using birds. And then numbers of some of the other ways in which we provision, we're sort of looking at maybe about 5 million nest boxes. The data's a bit older than that, and probably 1 million or so bird baths as well, sort of provisioning of water. But huge numbers. And the sort of industry, if you like, of bird feeding as well has grown, sort of historically. And I wrote an editorial for The Guardian about this, and you have this sort of apocryphal, story of feeding the sparrows, whatever, or pigeons stuck into a bag or whatever. But sort of bird feeding has evolved from being really cold and sticking out a little bit of bread for the birds too. I've got, people, I still have, like 5 or 6 different bird feeders, and people are feeding all these different types of, bespoke resources for birds. And this is just a sort of number of different bird products advertised. It's sort of increasingly, seemingly exponentially as we go. And there's always, essentially it's capitalism, right? We're sort of looking for a market and trying to increase that market share. So looking at different products we can sell and different things we can target for different species. So, a huge sort of growth industry, bird feeding. And, unsurprisingly, then, there are many sort of positive direct impacts on this wildlife, which is provision. So we know that, provision foodstuff can represent up to 75% of an individual feeder-using bird's diet. Can be up to 3/4 of what individual birds are eating is food that we provide for them. And that can lead to increased survival rates, particularly over winter, right? Think about how in this country, and again, this is changing with the climate, right? We're seeing less severe winters, but normally resident species, every so often will be hit with a major mortality event. I guess our last one was maybe 2009, 2010 winter, which was quite severe, for instance, which did deplete some bird populations. But we've, to a greater or lesser extent, we've insulated many bird populations from these cold winters by providing them with food. So that leads then to increased productivity, because you've got increased survivorship and increased reproductive rates. If birds are well fed, then you often healthier, and they can sort of have lower parasite loads, for instance. So end up with increased breeding densities, increased populations in abundance, and even increased ranges and increased residency. So there's quite good evidence that these sort of provisioning can really shape where bird populations even occur. And there's good evidence for this in Europe, there's good evidence in North America. One of the classic stories is the blackcap in Britain, for instance, where essentially, and we talk about this example quite a lot in the book on vagrancy, but an entirely sort of new wintering population of a species which was formerly formerly a migrant breeding in the UK. We're now receiving birds from further south in Europe, which are then migrating in winter in the UK to take advantage of our slightly warmer cities because of that sort of urban heat dome effect and this massive provisioning resources. So instead of flying to winter in Morocco or Spain, or even getting into equatorial Africa, just fly to England and spend the winter here. So a whole new wintering subpopulation evolving. In the States, several woodpecker species have been able to sort of march northwards because they're no longer limited by winter food availability, for instance. So we're changing the very distributions of these birds. A classic sort of indirect one is lesser black-backed gulls as well, which it wasn't sort of garden bird feeding, but rubbish truck provisioning basically made them shift from being mostly migratory, most of them would formerly winter in West Africa, to now many of them being resident. Although again, that's changing now because we're shutting down a lot of these landfills, for instance. So, birds and indeed both species are, sort of can be quite rapidly adapting to resource provisioning in sort of human modified landscapes. So we know that for many species, we've seen sort of major increases, many common bird species, major increases in feeder usage, and for many of these species, that's associated also with positive population trajectories. So you see that for most of these provision species here, they're sort of shifting to use feeders more over time rather than using feeders less over time. And we found that species which have positive population trajectories as well tend to be species which are using bird feeders rather than ones which aren't. So this is a paper from Kate Plummer at the PTO a couple of years ago. And I guess, if I ask people in this room, so why do you feed the birds? Do you want to offer, who does feed the birds? That's the first question. Few people, or at least whose family, parents, probably most people stick their hands up. So what's the motivation for feeding the birds?
Attract things into the garden.
Attract things into the garden. So but then what's the aim of that? Is that you helping birds, or are you bringing birds closer to you guys to see them?
I suppose it's to help birds as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Good winter, she said.
Yeah. Any other differing opinion?
I would mostly say just that I have something to look at, especially like during lockdown. It's like,
Yeah. Yeah. So that many people said there was an increase again in bird feeding because we were sort of deprived of some of our civil liberties, to protect folks. So in the inability to move out to nature, we wanted to bring nature towards us. So there was a big response as well with, and showed the importance of connection with nature, which I think is mostly the driver that underpins bird feeding, and certainly the reason why I've at least historically, fed my birds in the garden, because I could also bring in occasionally more unusual birds, like rather than just feeding goldfinches, they get the old siskin and brambling and even rebuntings in. So as a birder, my sort of primary motivation is sort of feeding the birds. Yeah, that's definitely a good thing. I like seeing birds, but then hopefully a chance of bringing something more interesting in. So, and we know that there's sort of a sort of positive cycle potentially baked into that as well, with people that end up feeding the birds, get more interested in birds, might end up joining the RSPB, something they're contributing money towards environmental charities, become more motivated, etc. as well. So there's sort of positive environmental benefits, and even if you don't go that far, there's sort of mental health benefits as well from connection with nature associated with bird feeding. So that it's almost like in many ways bird feeding, it certainly benefits lots of common birds, but it certainly benefits us a lot as well. But there are also then sort of both negative, direct and sort of indirect consequences for bird feeding. Some of these negative direct consequences include increased intra and interspecific disease transmission risk, an increase in predation risk by both natural predators and domestic pets. So we know that things like sparrowhawks from radiotelemetry studies will often hang out at feeders, which doesn't surprise me. A bird feeder for them is literally a bird feeder, right, where they go and get their birds to feed on. And again, bringing birds into gardens can make them more likely to be predated by cats, or more likely to crash into windows or whatever else. And there's also some emerging evidence of potential sort of nutritional consequences of eating 75% peanuts as well on sort of bird well-being. So a couple of papers looking at sort of sperm defects and blood chemistry changes in birds, for instance. So the classic one is emerging infectious disease then, which is sort of most well documented in greenfinches. And I'll slide in a second to show you, but probably look at that while I'm talking about it. So this shows this sort of gradual increase in greenfinch numbers, which is probably largely associated then with sort of bird feeding up until this point here in 2005, when there was a disease crossover event that basically driven by increases in wood pigeons in gardens. So historically, wood pigeons kind of avoided people because people like to eat wood pigeons quite a lot, but then people stopped eating wood pigeons as much. Wood pigeons became bolder, wood pigeons started moving into gardens, and we had this crossover event where a parasite, which is quite common in gallinaceous birds and pigeons, jumped into a load of passerine species. And it infected various species, but greenfinch was really, really badly affected. There's this catastrophic decline because of infection with this parasite, Trichomonas gallinae, which is this disease called trichomoniasis. And the birds still really haven't recovered from that. Some signs of recovery in some areas, but huge population crashes. This disease also affects other species, and there's early indications now, for instance, that recent declines in sparrowhawks may also be associated with trichomonas infection because they've been predating birds effectively, the trichomonas, for instance, and also crashes in collar dove, and increasingly crashes in chaffinch as well. Chaffinches have sort of hit this double barrel infection because there's also a papillomavirus which affects them, which can also be transmitted at feeders. So there are sort of big disease risks, and as a species ourselves coming out of this pandemic, sort of asking, well, we're sort of expecting all these multiple different taxa to feed from the same bit of plastic, and it is a bit of a it's not a natural accumulation of species which we wouldn't expect to occur in nature, and it's persistent as well, right? But you're feeding at the same place from the same object year round, whereas normally in nature there's a dynamism for when food is available, and it's not all available at the same site year round, and it's not all available at the same site, exactly the same space. So this is a big sort of risk with diseases, and again novel diseases as well. We've got paradate hawks, and there was a big disease outbreak in the US recently, which are potentially not bird feeder related, but may have something to do with that as well. So these are a couple of papers again looking at potential sort of consequences for individual well-being because of bird feeding. So it seemed that I think it was greenfinches on the top here that were essentially getting this sort of excess of omega-6 fatty acids from just eating sunflower seeds, I think. Another one showing changes in the blood chemistry of Australian magpies. So it's not like our magpies, a different branch of the passerine tree of life, but a species which actually sort of convergent in many ways, and which again showed to have sort of deleterious impacts from only eating sort of anthropogenic food handouts, for instance. And then something which I'm sort of more interested in, because this is all this sort of disease stuff is quite well established in literature, although in many ways it's quite surprising given that we've known about this sort of crash in greenfinch populations, that people have in many ways sort of shrugged their shoulders a bit about. They're sort of told to, wash feeders more or whatever, but just watch this sort of ongoing decline in some of our best loved species. But the novelty here really is some of these indirect impacts, many of which are very poorly sort of understood. And one of the key ones then is increased competition over natural resources, resulting in sort of reduced competitor population. So if you've got populations of one taxon going up, then you can expect other impacts with competitor species which are not being provisioned. We can expect hybridization on natural prey of recipient taxa. So if you've got more blue tits, then blue tits are being a lot of the blue tits are mostly eating anthropogenic foodstuff. That means there's more blue tits, and then they can then potentially drive down resource availability for insects or whatever else they're feeding on in the wider environment. So because there are more of them, we're decoupling that relationship between natural primary productivity, because we're sort of bringing in food from outside. You might be feeding goldfinches Niger seed, which has come from West Africa, which is actually an entirely different question then about, are we sort of exporting deforestation and losing tropical forests, with all their sort of spectacular endemic bird species to feed a common British bird species, for instance. So we also think about those sort of environmental teleconnections as well, which are important. Also be hybridization on non-provision competitor species. So if you imagine, populations of sparrowhawks could go up because you've got more blue tits to eat, but more sparrowhawks in a small woodland, might be more predation on other species which are not being provisioned. So again, complex food webs, you start pulling at levers and start altering the dynamics, you can expect interactions and new interactions. Mesopredator release following unintentional provisioning. So apart from birds, what comes into gardens and eats bird food? Rodents, right? That's the biggie, but other things as well, even foxes or your neighbour's cat or whatever it is. But rodents is a massive one. Which again can have unintended consequences. You not only potentially increase populations of rodents, but people don't like having brown rats or house mice or even wood mice eating their bird food, so that they end up putting poison out or whatever else, which again has cascading impacts to the ecosystem. So huge problems in this country with these sort of SGAR, second generation antibiotic rodenticides, which are seemingly everywhere in food chains now. Like probably declines in common kestrels are largely due to rodenticides. Basically, it's like whenever you look at a common kestrel, that it contains rodenticides, and that's probably having a big population level impact on some of these species. And some of that, maybe because of, everyone's feeding hundreds of thousands of tons of bird food, we've got more rodents in and around people's gardens, and people then putting out rodenticides to get rid of the rodents. And then increased community takeover by dominant and/or non-native invasive taxa. So an interesting example of that might be ringneck parakeets, for instance, in London. So that's a species which is probably entirely more or less supported by bird food, probably wouldn't proliferate without that provisioning. And there's some evidence that there may be competition, for instance, for nest sites with cavity nesting species like nuthatches and woodpeckers or others as well, although to be honest, those two species are quite dominant themselves. Elsewhere in the world, there's sort of better evidence for ringneck parakeet impacts, for instance. And then I've just touched on that as well, this sort of the idea of this ecological footprint with growing, packaging, and transporting provisions, right? Although there's really good evidence, for instance, that feeding farmland birds is critical. In the long run, we don't really want to be doing that. We want to have farmland ecosystems which can provide for farmland birds. It becomes an emergency conservation intervention to do that. But then, how much, instead of growing all that food for farmland birds, what if we, use those, thousands of hectares just to provide land for wildlife as well? So we've got all sorts of trade-offs to think about. Especially, it worries me a bit if we're moving food halfway around the world, and clearing primary vegetation to provide food to sell here. I think we might be doing some ecosystem disservices there. But what I'm really interested in, and what I'll sort of talk about for the remainder of this talk, is this idea of increased community takeover by dominant and/or non-native invasive taxa, which is something which is again received sort of very scant attention. So in this paper, then, we sort of argue then that the indirect impacts of bird feeding may be far more pervasive than currently appreciated. And across Europe, and indeed across many parts of the temperate zone, or indeed many parts of the tropical zone, where we're sort of fundamentally altering ecosystems, we're seeing sort of this rise of the generalists, right? species with broader sort of realized niches, species which are able to cope with human modified landscapes are becoming more abundant, and then there's a concomitant decline in the abundance of more specialist taxa. And another key point to take home with this then is that this dominance is often then related to, this sort of generalist nature is often quite closely tied to species which are socially dominant as well. So you're more likely to have a broader niche if you're a dominant species. And that has various impacts. It means that the subordinate species often have, end up becoming specialists, and you have to develop all sorts of different life history traits, which means they can compete with these aggressive dominant species. So if one species is socially dominant to another, the subordinate usually narrows its niche in which they occur together. So this comes back to that slide I showed you some time ago, the paper in PNAS with the house sparrow and the tree sparrow. So for instance, in areas where only one taxon occurs, for instance, if you're going to big part, large areas of China, tree sparrows is hyper-abundant bird in cities, but here in this country, it's a declining, although showing signs of increasing, but sort of is displaced essentially by house sparrow. So this is again from a paper from 74 here. And the presence of dominance is a factor making conditions uncertain for subordinates. So this idea of social dominance then, as we mentioned before, mediating interactions between species. And what we see in the UK then is, these sorts of spectacular increases in some of these dominant species. Great tit here, great speckled woodpecker here. Great speckled woodpecker is like an increase of 300% or something. Great tits, an increase of 40%. So we've ended up with millions more of some of these species. And at the same time, they've gone up. And they've been helped on their way by bird feeding. Remember the paper from Plummer et al. Earlier. We've been losing various different subordinate species. So a good example of marsh tit here, another one, lesser spotted woodpecker. If we'd been giving this talk sort of 30 or 40 years ago on this campus, I think we'd have been relatively easily would have found marsh tit, lesser spotted woodpecker and willet tit. Do you still have lesser spots on campus?
They're around, but they're not breeding.
Okay. Marsh tit, no. So willetit's basically gone from Essex. It was still here, so I'm actually born in Colchester. And when I sort of grew up in South Essex, there were still, because these relatively easily find marsh and willetits still, lesser spotted woodpeckers were still relatively common. They probably got a big sort of bonus from the 1987 hurricane, which was lots of deadwood. So it was kind of, when I was growing up, it was quite a good time to find that species. But again, it's a species like, I scarcely see anymore lesser spotted woodpecker. I think the last one I saw was in like Bulgaria about 5 or 6 years ago. And, used to be an easy bird to find, but it's declining rapidly and rapidly and rapidly. It's probably fewer lesser spotted woodpeckers in the country now than there are little eaglets, for instance. But the species which has really crashed is willet tit, which is it's the endemic subspecies Klein-Schmidti of willet tit is sort of on course to go extinct from being a relatively common species, and it's almost entirely now. This is old data now from up until 2011, but it's basically now absent from a line from the Severn to the Wash here. It's like one bird, I think, left in Norfolk, perhaps, a couple in Wiltshire. It's basically disappeared from most of Lincolnshire here already. It's disappearing so fast. And the thing about willet tits is that, the science has been done to look at the reasons why. And we always think, right, the first thing we think is the species is declining. It's something to do with habitat, right? We reach for that because normally it is, right? It's because we've fragmented or degraded or destroyed entirely species habitat. But we've crunched the data on the habitat stuff for these species, and there's no great signal for habitat loss. And the interesting thing about this species pair, the marsh and willet tit, we've got a picture of marsh and willet tit. Well, they both look almost the same. Like this species has like a pale wing panel, and it has some differences with build morphology and whether the cap's shiny or glossy or whatever. Some of the last British species to be recognised as separate species. They're so similar, basically. But anyway, willet tit is like an early successional bird species. It occupies young woodlands. Marsh tit is a bird of like ancient woodlands. And in this country, we've got more ancient woodland. Well, we've got sort of more greater woodland extent than we had, 40, 50 years ago. Got more old and maturing deciduous woodland. Admittedly, we maybe have slightly less of some of the early successional habitat, but there is still a lot of early successional woodland as well, which the willet tit likes. So there's no obvious signal for habitat as being the driver of the decline of these species. And sort of having read, read some of Oliver Rackham's stuff by any chance. And I was sort of drawn back to, he had a map of Chalkley Wood, which is where I sort of went running around as a kid, right? And maps of Chalkley Wood from like the sort of 14th and 15th century of having exactly the same extent as today, right? So this is wood near Earl's Cone, so not very, only sort of 15, 20 miles away from here, and the woodland itself is the same size. Probably management's changed a bit, but fundamentally the British countryside is very, very similar. I mean, some things have changed, but woodland extent and quality has been increasing, not decreasing. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that people have failed to sort of tie habitat change to the decline of some of these bird species. And we're increasingly seeing like a homogenization of British bird communities. I remember reading in a birdwatching mag recently, a bloke who lives in Epping Forest, again, not too far away from here, one of the nicest ancient woodlands in southern Britain. And it's like, the bird species which occur in Epping Forest are entirely the same bird species which occur in his garden. They've lost Lesser woodpecker, lost marsh tit, lost willet tit, lost redstart. All of the classic obligate woodland species have disappeared from that habitat, which is still an ancient woodland. So something's going on. Maybe there's something to do with deer or disturbance as well. But fundamentally, what has changed is that the abundance of some of these generalists has gone through the roof in this stage. So what we do know about willet tits, and a lot of this work is sort of done by colleague Richard Broughton. We'll talk about a bit more in a minute. Broughton rather. So he's sort of the world expert on these two. And what they found. When you actually do the ornithological work, rather than just looking at what's where and habitat associations, when you're following these birds through the annual cycle, they're just failing to breed basically. And with willet tits, I talked earlier on about these adaptations that these species have. So willet tit, as a specialist, does various things which blue and great tits don't. The most sort of novel thing it does, which not even marsh tit does, is to dig its own nest. So like all the tits, it's a cavity nester, but it excavates its own nest. And it does that, usually occupies early successional woodland habitats. And by doing that, it can occupy areas where blue and great tits can't nest because there are no natural cavities. So that's, a really, really good life history trait to have, except that, they lose these cavities. Like, so all in this study by Harry and Broughton, then all the nest losses during the excavation phase were caused by eviction by blue tits, which are responsible for more than a third of losses during laying or incubation, and 40% of all 58% nest failures. And this pattern replicates itself in various parts of the country. So we've got an increasing number of blue tits and of great tits, and they're wandering around looking for cavities to nest in, and they're displacing these willet tits. And then at the egg stage, most nest loss is 62% due to predation. Most important nest predator in this system is great-spotted woodpecker, another species which has gone up because of bird feeding. So you've got sort of two beneficiaries here, blue and great tits, and they're really hammering these willet tits because they're either stealing their nests or stealing their nestlings. And so essentially, if we look across different taxa then, it's almost a repetition from earlier on, we find that sort of feeder usage is associated with increased population trends. But we also find then species which are outcompeted by blue tits and great tits tend to be species doing less well, and these species which are suffering nest site competition from these species. So a strong signal for them, potentially for generalists, to be effective distribution of specialists. So essentially, bird feeding might subvert the coexistence strategies of these subordinates. So thinking about the marsh willet tit example we talked about, so the subordinate species, and we know this from again. Sort of tracking studies from places like Witham Woods, that things like marsh and willet tits, they're faster at finding ephemeral resources. So imagine the days before bird feeders, the birds were moving through the woodland, which both marsh and willet tits, they have permanent territories. So they have an area of wood which they know really, really well. Whereas blue and great tits don't maintain permanent territories. In winter, they disappear off to other areas. So they're limited by their site, but they know it very well, so they can detect and find food well. We know that because tag birds were fastest to find bird feeders which have been stuck up at different places in the woodland. So that's a survival trait, is to be able to find food fastest, right? Both species also catch food, right? So they find food. Imagine they're finding in autumn the nut crops or whatever, the birds are burying them for winter, just like coal tits do. If you've got a bird feeder, it's almost like when I was feeding birds in my garden, it'd be like trying to tell the coal tit to stop. The food's going to be there the whole time. Don't worry about it. It keeps burying food all over my garden, all winter. It's not going to be there all winter. Of course, the bird doesn't know that. It's just doing what it does and is hoarding food. But again, that speaks to this problem, right? If that's a survival strategy these species have for hard times, But if bird food's always available, then what's the point in caching behaviour, right? Things like marsh tits as well are very powerful bills. They can actually exploit different food resources that blue and great tits can't as well. And then there's a whole suite of other species which are long-distance migrants, right? As a strategy, you can be a resident species, which you might have to diet switch in winter. You don't have to undergo the perils of migration, but you risk these 2009, 2010 winters, or even worse than 1962, 63 winter, when you might have catastrophic population losses. And of course, migrant birds also suffer massive losses as well. Migration's a risky strategy, but it should pay off now and then. You should get a hard winter when the warblers and the chats come back into the woodlands, and it's far quieter because a lot of resident bird species have died. But again, if these birds aren't dying over winter, then that survival strategy starts to look worse and worse, and especially when we are things like the Sahara is becoming a more difficult barrier. These birds are losing critical staging areas on migration. There's all this global change on top of this change that's happening here, which essentially is making migration as a sort of phenomenon, more and more difficult for many species. And then nest box provision as well may be another issue, right? Imagine what often happens in new nature reserves, and where willow tits currently are, like where I'm based in Manchester, is one of the best places for them. So we've got lots of sort of old industrial sites which have been essentially like passively rewilded. Lots of carves, sort of wet woodland has come up in these sites, and they've been colonised by willow tits, which you'd expect. And then a lot of these areas have become nature reserves, and then people have gone and stuck loads of nest boxes up in these areas. It's one of the first things people do, right? Well, we need to, make these places better for wildlife. And you've got a grant. What do you do with a grant? How can you, you buy a load of nest boxes, put the nest boxes up, and then you're just letting blue and great tits into that system, and then those blue and great tits are parasitising the nests those willow tits have carefully dug. And the willow tit might try and dig 3 in a season, lose all 3, fails to breed. So, for a bird which is not living that long, that's how you get collapse quite quickly in recruitment. And again, potentially competition, if you're putting up nest boxes in woodland areas, you might be increasing the number of habitat availability of cavity nesters. Is that a cost for open cut nesters, right? That's another strategy, is building a nest not in a cavity. For things like wood warblers, maybe, the link here is far more tenuous than is the case with the willow tit example, but there may be a signal for competition, because still the amount of food resources in these woodlands is limited. And if one taxon is being favoured by these conservation interventions, then there may be knock-on effects for other species. So just some examples here, most of which we've touched on then. See in the blue here, a whole raft of species which are going up, largely because of feeding. On the right, lots of species going down, for which bird provisioning and competition with other species may well be a factor driving some of those declines. And so we end up with all sorts of different interactions then from feeding, right? We've got our sort of increases in domestic mesopredators or alien species. Grey squirrel is obviously a taxon which again does very well from bird feeding. Obviously, an entire industry sort of propped up just from stopping squirrels eating your bird food, for instance. And then interaction with other invasives, interactions with feeding populations of corvids, for instance, which may end up predating or being nest predators across other taxa as well. Increase what we talked on about increases in predators, and then a lot of potential negative interactions for our willow tit here. Be that sort of nest predation by squirrels, or competition from other tits, or predation by sparrowhawks, or nest predation by magpies, etc. So lots of ways in which bird feeding, could potentially negatively impact some of these sort of species which are not benefiting from feeding. So along with Richard, then we wrote up a piece in British Birds after the Bio-Con article, essentially arguing that some of these nature reserves where bird feeding is happening, that still have willow tits, it's probably an interest of precautionary principle to stop feeding in those areas. After writing this paper, there's been obviously lots of people have come to me and said, should I stop feeding birds in my garden? And I don't know the answer to that. And it's probably going to have to be quite nuanced, right? It's quite possible that bird feeding may be propping up populations of things like house sparrows and starlings, both red-listed species in the country, in cities which are increasingly sort of hermetically sealed environments with very little natural resources. And, we might be a disfavour if people turned off the tap for those species. But the evidence for me is overwhelming that, we shouldn't be providing food for for anywhere that still has these relictual willetip populations. I know that others might argue, well, maybe we need a bit more information. We could lose this endemic subspecies, within 15, 20 years, unless something's done. So even if that turned out to be a bad, or did turn out not to help, at least we tried, and now's the time to do that if that's the case. So just reaching out, last couple of slides here. There's also potentially impact on ecosystem services, right? If blue tits are eating 75% peanuts, then what are they not eating? What are they not doing, right? And again, evidence in the UK is again quite anecdotal. We don't really have a good handle on this. It's quite interesting studies elsewhere. So in South Africa, they've shown that again, people feed a very sort of community of nectarivores there. You've got all these various cool taxa from white eyes to sunbirds here and bulbuls, which come into people's gardens on these sort of effectively what hummingbird feeders are in the New World, right? And these birds, because they're being provided this nectar, then it seems that local areas of fynbos around these areas, there's less pollination happening because why wouldn't you? You just go and get your resources from one spot, and it seems to be interfering with ecosystem services there. I was sort of last summer, I had a little cherry tree in my garden, and it was absolutely covered in aphids, and I was watching the blue tits sort of fly 4 doors down to get peanuts and sort of shaking my fist at them to come and remove these aphids from my tree, and it never happened. They never gleaned the damn thing, produced no cherries. So again, very anecdotal, but you can imagine that there may be sort of similar things happening then. And this, again, it sort of comes back to this wider sort of picture of our interventions in landscapes. And something I thought about for a long time ago is the sort of provisioning this huge resource boon alongside bird feeding is even like, game animals as well. So, millions of pheasants, for instance, what are the cascading impacts, some positive, potentially some negative across the ecosystems? I think, there's been increasingly sort of attention turned to this angle here, but in many ways, it's a bit fictitious with many people for the bird feeding angle, because they're like, oh, is this, what have we done here collectively? And I think that I come back to think about a lot with the greenfinch example, simply because we've known about it for so long, but we don't really seem to have sort of cottoned onto it. But you could draw, again, similar impacts for various different systems, in which case we've interfered with energy flows into systems, and a huge boom in nutrients and energy flows will have these cascading impacts across systems. And it's quite interesting that if you look globally, what are sort of attitudes towards bird feeding, then, most of the world, people are very positive about feeding birds. It's actively encouraged by conservation NGOs, with sort of a major sort of Antipodean exception in Australia, where it's very, very frowned upon, bird feeding. And that's largely because they have a system with, essentially, this is a species called noisy miner, which is sort of this honey eater, which has this sort of despotic life history. They're a sort of semi-colonial species which can literally exclude like all other passerine birds from its territory. And it really sort of monopolizes bird feeding, and the sort of increase in feeding for this and another completely unrelated species, the rainbow lorikeet, means that you can get sort of homogenization of bird communities very quickly because of feeding the areas become dominated by this species and the lorikeet, and collapse of all the other species. So there, it's sort of really frowned upon by conservation NGOs. Really cool paper. This avifaunal disarray due to a single despotic species. And again, taken from the same paper here, nature species affected by human activities can become agents that induce ecological dysfunction. And sort of our argument is we might be somewhere along the way here in the UK as well, because again, it's been this sort of gradual upping of this resource allocation without sort of profoundly asking yourself, what are the ecological questions? And again, it shouldn't necessarily be, let's stop bird feeding. There should be more emphasis on, making gardens better for wildlife. Just looking around where I live locally, that shifts to plastic gardens, and there's a plastic garden with 3 bird feeders, and the person there thinking, well, I've done my bit for wildlife. I'm, feeding 5 species of common bird species. Whilst, my garden might be home to 10,000 other organisms, but as it is, it's home to 35 or whatever, because we've reduced habitat complexity and quality. So, thinking about that message, how can we don't want to lose this connection with nature, which is incredibly important for us. So how can we supplant that? And it might well be along the urban-rural gradient, because, in the middle of Colchester, there are never going to be any marshal willetits, right? But maybe, if we weren't feeding there, we lose those last colonies of house sparrows. So we just need to be much more evidence-based about what's going on with bird feeding. So this story, it ran a long way for something which was just a sort of throwaway story that we think, well, let's write this up. It's quite interesting, you know. Well, the story has run and run and run. Most recently, I spoke to somebody from Scientific American about it, thinking about the US system as well. And it was, to be honest, born of, I never even wrote a press release for this. I wrote like a Twitter thread, and somebody from The Guardian saw the thread, asked me to write an editorial, and the whole thing snowballed from there. So it's also a sort of interesting story in science communication, and sort of eventually 10 days later from that ended up on the sort of the big breakfast sofa talking about the story. So, which is again, quite a difficult challenge to try and talk about something in 3 minutes, which has got all this nuance, which probably didn't particularly achieve, and you really need at least an hour to chat about all the issues here. But anyway, hot take for this then, summing up, you know, it seems that there's reasonable evidence that we might be eroding biodiversity because of this provisioning, basically. We need to understand then these interactions. We need to, you know, falsify them and check, is this definitely what's happening? You know, I think it's reasonably well evidence for willitit, but for many other species, you know, it's not. And there's obviously, these are complex systems, and we know that, you know, it's rarely the case where it's a single driver that underpins declines in any given species. But, you know, if it is bird feeding, well, it is something that's quite tangible we can do something about, whereas some of these other impacts actually might be quite difficult to deal with. So we need to think about, you know, what is actionable as well. And again, we need to reappraise advice on bird feeding, you know, and be location and food stuff specific. So a lot of modelling then to work out where it might be doing good, where it might be doing harm, where are the trade-offs, etc. Might be feeding different things at different times of the year. And, you know, we can feed things which aren't providing blue tip, providing peanuts, it's mostly feeding blue and great tips, whereas, you know, providing other foodstuffs for finches, you know, as long as you're cleaning the feeders, probably has far less of an impact, for instance. So again, you know, more science needed. So I guess that sums it up. I did throw this in there because I mentioned this in a podcast to someone at the BBC for Radio 4 about this, and I sort of had this off-the-cuff remark about sort of great tits being sort of rapacious flesh-rending predators, and everyone thinks about, you know, great tits, but they are, I mean, amazing things that are like going in and eating pipistrel brains, and there was an amazing video of them predating redpolls in Finland as well. So, you know, some of these species which are increasing, you know, we think about the trophic links between them, and I don't want to demonize blue and great tits, which are amazing birds as well, but really to think about the ecological role of these species within systems and think about sort of what we're doing and why.
Thank you very much. We can have questions about it has them. There's certainly the case that some of these birds are basically nasty dinosaurs. Yep. Okay, let me just stop recording.